The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everyone. My name is TJ VanToll. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that I think is pretty exciting, and that's building financial dashboards with React. Now, as I said, my name is TJ. I am a developer advocate on the Kendo React team. I am coming to you from my luxurious home office here in Lansing, Michigan in the United States. And we are quarantined at home like everybody else. So as I said, I work on the Kendo React team. If you have not heard of Kendo React before, it is our library, our premium suite of UI components for helping React developers build really awesome applications. Now, today's webinar is about financial dashboards, but I want to give you a little bit more of a sense of what to expect. So we're going to open up with a series of best practices, and I'll be drawing on some of my expertise. I've been doing front-end development, JavaScript development for over a decade at this point, and I've worked on a lot of large applications, and also from the Kendo React team as well. So we have experience working with a lot of customers and users. We have customers that are working in the financial space with banks and such and large data sets. So I'll be sharing some best practices in terms of how to approach building these sorts of applications. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time actually coding. So we are going to build out a small little financial dashboard. We're talking about planning out a layout, creating an app structure, and then spend the bulk of our time working with user interface components, as that's really our expertise here on the Kendo React team. And then finally, there are a few logistical things I want to mention here before we dive in. First of all, this is being recorded. So if you run into some technical issues or you need to drop off for whatever reason, you will receive an email afterward. I have a link to recording. Also, sources like that. So just know that that'll be available to you afterwards to follow up on anything that you're curious about. And next, questions. So we want to make this somewhat of an interactive session. So if you have questions, whether it's questions that you're coming in with or things that come up on the material I'm presenting, GoToWebinar has a handy little questions pane in the client. Now, even though I am here by myself, we have other members of the Kendo React team that are here digitally, spiritually with me today, and they'll be helping out with questions. So make sure to ask those. And we might do some of them live as well. So we'll have to see how we're doing on time. Now, we also want to make today's webinar interactive in other ways as well, because otherwise it'll just be me talking to my monitor here in my office by myself for 45 minutes, and that's kind of depressing. So we have a series of polls, and why don't we go ahead and throw the first one up? And if you could take a second to answer this, we'd appreciate it. So the first poll is, what is the most important factor when choosing a UI component library? So you can actually select one or more from this. So it is either the number of components in the library. Are you just looking for a large number of components out there? Are you looking for particular features? So is there a specific problem that you're trying to solve? Do you want to customize the components? Are you looking for things like extensibility hooks? Are you concerned about the package footprint, trying to keep your apps small and lean? And then the final option is the price. So are you concerned about trying to find free and open source solutions? So you can select one or more of these. There is a correct answer though, and you are being graded. So make sure you get this correct. No, there isn't, but it will be interesting. I know I have my answer to this has actually changed quite a bit over the years. So I'm looking over here and the results. Good, we have a good number of people voting, actually up to about half of people voting. And actually, oh, interesting. So I think we can give people a few more seconds as a few more votes are coming in, but so far, the two that are running away with this are the features of particular components and also customizing the components to meet our needs. So I think we can actually close this. There we go, close it up. So yeah, it looks like customizing components and features of a component. So that's interesting. So we'll try to touch on this as we go through the content. All right, so let's actually dive into financial dashboards. And I don't know about you, but for me personally, when I think of financial dashboards, the first sort of thought or phrase that comes to mind is, if I go back to my slides here, complexity. Dashboards are usually, by their very nature, trying to bring in a lot of either data or functionality and show them in one place. And so that just is inherent to a pretty big scope and a lot going on a single page. So when we think about best practices for building these types of applications, these are best practices for building financial dashboards, but they're also kind of just best practices for building just big apps in general. And I have a few tips and tricks I want to share, and then we'll look at actually implementing these when we dive into code. So the first best practice I have is to strive as best you can to use semantic markup and to try to minimize the amount of nesting you do in your applications. Because I'm sure if you've been doing web development long enough, you've all built apps that look like this, or perhaps far worse. I know I'm guilty of creating absolute horrific HTML structures. But the reason this is important is dashboards, because they are so large, and because they are also the types of apps that tend to stick around for a long time. If you're building an app for a financial institution or a bank, an insurance company, these are the sorts of apps that tend to have to be maintained for years and years and years. And the more sane you can make your markup structure, the easier you're going to find to maintain that application over years. Now, this, of course, a little bit of this is like, duh, of course you want to keep things simple, but the specifics are sometimes hard to pull off. So I'll share one thing that I do that you might find useful. So the first thing I'll do is start with some sort of a sketch of my app, which might be something I do personally. This is something I created in Balsamiq, which is a little sketching tool. Or it might be something if you're working for a larger company that maybe your design team throws together for you. So what I like to do is take this sort of high-end mockup, and this is actually what we are going to be building today when we switch over to coding here in a minute, and just really quickly map up what I think the markup structure is going to be like. And when I do this, I like to think of sort of the semantics of what I'm building and not necessarily the layout. And the reason for this is that CSS is quite good nowadays at letting you sort of move around pieces of your application to meet your needs without having to clutter up your markup with a bunch of extra divs and classes and such. So that is my approach for solving this, and I'll show this here in a minute when we dive into actually starting up on coding this dashboard. So that's my first tip, trying to keep your semantics, your markup semantic and also minimal wherever possible. I've got 4 different tips, so that was the first one. The second one is strive to have some coding conventions for the applications that you build. These are, again, things that are just tips in general for working on apps that are big, complex, and working with teams. And actually, specifically, React, I did years and years of writing Angular applications. And I know this is a React audience, so if you want to hiss and boo at me through your screen for using Angular, you can, because don't worry, by myself. But one of the things I really liked about Angular is Angular has really a set of code conventions that lay out how you're supposed to build Angular apps, which is actually, for me as a developer advocate and someone that has to jump into other people's projects quite a bit, quite nice, because it means things were quite consistent. And when coming to React, I was surprised to find that React, at least by comparison, tends to be the Wild West in terms of you can do just about anything, which can be powerful, but can also be problematic when you start to scale out and build really complex applications. So having some of these coding conventions is really nice. And the specifics actually don't matter so much. So there are some really good guides out there. There are a number of different style guides. Airbnb has a really, really popular one, and I've got a link to it down there. And again, I'll share these slides at the end, so if you're interested in following up on any of these, don't worry about missing any of these links. But Airbnb has a really good style guide out there that you might want to follow. It's all the way down to things of like how to handle indentation within your JSX and spacing and parentheses, and things that seem trivial but can matter when you're building out things at a pretty big scale, like a financial dashboard. Another tool I recommend is ESLint. So ESLint is basically just a way of enforcing these types of styles. So if you want to make sure people use a correct number of spaces or tabs or follow given structures, ESLint is a great way of enforcing this. And actually, if you create React apps through the Create React App tool, you may or may not know that you're actually getting some ESLint functionality by default. So through Create React App, the ESLint config React app sort of pre-configured structure is set up for you. If you've ever been building with React and you have an image and you forget to bring in the alt and you have the console yell at you, it's this pre-configuration that's actually doing that yelling. But for me personally, at least, the sort of built-in configuration is not nearly strict enough. I would want to enforce far more consistency. And the Create React App tool actually now allows you to extend the built-in ESLint configuration if you want to bring in additional rules. And I'll actually show how to do this here in a minute, because it's quite powerful of enforcing some structure in the React apps that you build. And the last thing I'll mention across just sort of consistency and coding conventions is an editor config file. And I'll show this in the app as well, but basically this is just a small, really simple, easy file that you can add to your applications to use consistent tabs versus spaces, and number of spaces, or can't even talk. Actually, I should have, we totally missed out on a chance to make a poll question on just tabs versus spaces to see where everybody stands. I was a longtime tab person, which might disappoint some of you, maybe half of you, but for some reason the JavaScript community decided that 2 spaces for indentation was the way to go, and there was some decree made, and slowly over time I reluctantly switched over, and now I'm on the 2 space for indentation team. So I'm sorry if I just lost half of my viewers today, but that's where I stand today. But again, my second tip is just to have these conventions, and actually the specifics don't matter, but more about having an organizational or app-wide standard for how you approach coding up these large applications. All right, so those are 2 tips. I said I had 4 total. And the third one I have is to decide on tools that you want to use. And I call this decide on tools, but I think I actually would change, I probably should have worded this to lean on tools a little more heavily than you might otherwise do. At least if you're anything like me, the web developer in me is really hesitant to bring in any additional tooling really at all. And over time, as I've gotten, well, as JavaScript has gotten more complex, and as we build more and more complex things with JavaScript frameworks, I'm finally reluctantly coming around on different tools and how they can help me just build out the apps that I need to build. And the first one of these, and this might be controversial as well, is TypeScript. So this is a tool I've definitely come full circle on. I went from a full-on TypeScript hater to someone that was skeptical, and now I'm fully on the TypeScript bandwagon. I was a late joiner, but I'm now a strong proponent of TypeScript. And we here at Progress on the Kendo React team are as well. So Kendo React is actually written completely in TypeScript. A lot of our demos are written in TypeScript. And as you'll see, I think it's a tool that can really help when you're building out these sort of applications at scale, because just some of the small things it does, just some of the benefits it gives you, even in your text editor, can be enormous for your productivity and also for your code quality as well. Along a similarly, there is Sass, which I've also sort of went full circle on. I always don't want to use Sass, but at the end of the day, I find that it's a really elegant way of styling or separating out the CSS I write for my applications. So you'll see that we use that in Kendo React pretty heavily. Our themes are written in Sass, and we provide some extensibility hooks through Sass as well. The last one I have on my list is style components, or really any of the CSS and JavaScript tools. And this one, I'm not going to full on recommend, because for me, I'm sort of still on the fence. And actually, I'd be curious if you want to jump into the chat or questions here. I'd be curious if any of you have built with something like style components at scale in a large app. So I went from full on like hater of this approach as well to I tried it out, and now I'm sort of on the fence. But something I don't have, and the reason I'm not totally recommending it, is I haven't tried using it in like a really large app to see if it actually improves sort of how I architect my code. So it's definitely something I would experiment with if I were starting out on, say, like a new really big dashboard app today, because it essentially lets you group your CSS code along with the markup in the JSX where it's actually being used. which is sort of an interesting way of approaching architecting an app like this. So definitely something worth checking out. All right, so those are my first 3 tips. I have one more. So we've got use semantic markup, we've got established coding conventions, we've got decide on some tools. And my final tip is to strive to minimize your dependencies. And this it's sort of along the same vein of these sorts of apps, these big financial dashboards are apps that stick around for a while. And the fewer moving pieces that you have, the easier you're going to make your life and also your teammates' life and your organization's life throughout the lifespan of your app. Because all of us at some point have written an app with a package.json that looks something like this. And over time, just keeping track of this becomes hard. And it also means your app gets quite large because at the poll question earlier, we talked about the package footprint and we had 26% of people that cared about that. But the thing about dashboards specifically is that let's just say they're not known for being fast, just because of their very nature of bringing in all sorts of nonsense up into building a page. The more you can do to keep that to a minimum, the better, the happier you will make your users from your app being rather easy to use. And actually, this is, to me, where Kendo React comes into the equation quite nicely. So Kendo React is a suite of user interface components for React. And we actually have quite a few components. I think at the moment we have 70 some of these. And what's really appealing to me about the Kendo React approach is that instead of trying to piece together a number of different UI components that you find from around the web, like you definitely can do a Google search and find an elegant date picker for React and find a good calendar widget, those sorts of things as well. But trying to make them work cohesively is a real challenge. And that's really important when you're building something like a dashboard where you do need a bunch of these widgets. Like dashboards have all sorts of UI challenges going on with them, but you need them to work together and look like they belong together as well. So these are the sort of things that I want to show off in action. And to do that, I am going to build an app for the fictitious company Acme Stocks. So Acme Stocks they're my fictitious company, so I can make them do whatever I want them to do. And in my case, I want them to view mutual funds. So mutual funds are typically made up of a bunch of different stocks or bonds and such. And you need to view a bunch of different information about them. Maybe know who are the people behind the fund, how their funds are allocated, how it's been doing over the years, what different stocks that you are invested in. They typically have quite a bit of data involved with them. So we're going to build out a small dashboard for them and try to put some of those tips and tricks that we just looked at into action. Now, before we do that, and I'll need a second to set things up as well, let's go ahead and launch the second of our polls because this will give me a second to set things up. So I think we can go ahead and put that up on the screen. There we go. So we are curious if you are currently looking for a UI library for React. So either yes, you are looking for a React component for a project. Yes, you're actually looking for an entire library to standardize upon. Maybe you're looking for something for an entire app or maybe for a suite of apps throughout your organization. No, your team is using everything internally. Maybe you have your own internal UI team that builds up this sort of stuff, or just using open source software. Or no, you have some other reason you are not currently looking. And if that's the case too, you can use the chat panel in GoToWebinar to let us know what you think. So we have some votes coming in. I'm going to leave that up for just a second. And while that's up, so I'm going to switch over. Oop, GoToWebinar's got to go with me there. There we go. So we can leave that up for a few more seconds to give people a chance to answer. And yeah, why don't we go, so we're up to 50%, that's pretty good. It's looking like early on, actually this is incredibly even. So about half of people, a little under half of people said yes, they're looking, and it's pretty evenly split between looking for a specific React component and looking for a library. And then about half of people are at no as well. A lot of no for another reason. So I'll be curious to look through the chat later. I think we can close this up to look at the results. And there we go. So the winner was no for another reason, but quite a few yeses as well. So that's very interesting. All right. So now it's time. Let's see how we're doing on time. Excellent. We're doing pretty good. So it's my time for my favorite part of this and actually getting in and coding and looking at how some of these things work in action. So I've got the Acme Stocks app, and if I bring over, where I got it over here, the sort of sketch, the mock-up of what we want to build, it looks a little something like this. And you'll see that I got started on just sort of the high-level markup stuff. So I've got my panels here, and I've got one panel sort of built out for each of these things that we're going to actually implement with user interface components. Now, the first thing I want to do is actually talk about styling these things. So I'm going to open up some layouts in my SAS here. And what I want to do is actually, so if you've built dashboards like this before, or really if you've built any sort of large apps, actually, I need this open and also the layout open as well, dashboard. And I'm going to put the dashboard down here so that we can see them both. You might know that typically, if you're using something like Bootstrap, you might throw a whole bunch of class names on these panels to sort of say, well, this should be take up 12 columns and extra large screens and you know, all these sort of complex class names, which is an option that works. And if you're comfortable using that, then absolutely go ahead and keep doing that. But I want to show you a different way of approaching this using CSS grid layout. Now, if you're new to this, the idea, at least at a high level, is pretty simple. Essentially, what you do is you take your parent component and mark that as a grid container, basically saying this is the container for my grid. And then within it, you define, so we've got grid template rows. You can divide your screen up into rows and columns. So we've got rows and columns. We'll say auto. And what this is going to do is divide our screen up into 2 rows and 2 columns. Once it refreshes, let me make sure this is, I'm going to go ahead and restart this up. This has been sitting around for a while. But when this refreshes, you'll see that the screen will get divided up into 2 rows and 2 columns for this grid container. So I'll give this a second to start up. And what I like about this is this works exactly like a grid that you might use really using any other technology. Essentially, you get the ability to divide your screen up into rows and columns. And if we look at this, for example, this information panel on the left-hand side of the screen, we actually want this to span and take up multiple different rows on the screen. So to do that, all I need to do is head down into this info panel and say grid row, and I want this to span 2 different rows. And then when I refresh this, there we go. Yeah, so my watcher there must have got stuck earlier. If I put in this grid, I can see that my info panel is now actually spanning 2 rows. And actually, let's give this 3 columns. And as another tip and trick, if you've used grid layout before, you might know that Firefox, so I'm a Firefox proponent as well. I won't apologize for it, but its developer tools for grid layout is actually, it's actually quite good. So you can go in here and view segments of the grid. It'll let you do all sorts of things in terms of debugging. So I like to do this, it helps me catch silly mistakes that I might be making. So I want to actually, so we're going to do 3 columns. Let's make the first one like 225 pixels. I think that's going to be look right as we start to build this up. So I've got the info panel that I want to span across multiple rows. And the other thing I want to do is this panel at the bottom, which is going to take up our grid. If I go down, I want it to span 2 columns, which should switch, and then that line should go away. Oh, there we go. Took a second. My watcher is playing tricks with me. But when that spans panel positions, see grid column, yeah, it should span across two different columns. So we'll look at that later on to see whether that works. But in general, grid layout is a fun way of just giving you another option for how you lay out your user interface components. And what I really like about it is that when it comes to making your applications responsive, essentially if you want to control what happens when you move on to smaller screens, instead of having to use sort of verbose class names, you can do things like say, hey, when the screen gets down to 750 pixels, let's switch this over to being a 2-column setup. And then we might get down to 500 pixels. Actually, let's just move down to 1 column to stack things on top of each other. And you'll see that you can quite easily sort of achieve that approach. And you'll see what it looks like too as we build this out and we add a little bit more complexity to these panels. So overall, I'd encourage you, if you are new to grid layout, to actually check it out. It's surprisingly well supported. So if I just look up browser support for grid layout, right now, it's basically supported everywhere. If you're still supporting IE 10 and 11, you actually still can use grid layout. It is in those browsers, but there's a slightly different syntax for some of the rules. So you will need to jump through a few extra hoops to actually make sure your apps continue to work in those browsers, but you can still use the technology. The implementations are still in there. All right, so that is our high level layout. The other thing I want to show, I think the second on our tips and tricks, so we talked about layout, we also talked about establishing using tools, so I also showed a little bit of Sass and TypeScript. But I wanted to show real quick how you can extend ESLint to add a little bit more checking in terms of a verification for coding conventions into your application. So what you do is create React app is going to ask you to create a .env file. So there are a number of different environment variables you can use to customize how create React app works. And one new one that you can add is extend ESLint. And when you do that, you can add a little bit of extra code to your package JSON, where you're saying, this is my ESLint config. I'm going to extend the built-in React app, but I'm also going to add a new rule here. And I'm basically going to say this curly equals warn. And if you go to ESLint's site, you can actually find a full list of these things. So it's in user guide rules. And there are a lot. You can go kind of nuts. You can also find presets in here, like the React app is a preset, for example. But what this curly one will do is if I try to do something like, I don't know, that's bad code to write anyways. But if I write a statement like this that does not include a curly brace, essentially if I don't include this, then I'm going to get a warning that's going to tell me it's expecting to have a curly brace here. I could also set this to an error if I wanted to prevent code like this from compiling. That's another option I have available to me. So I find things like that, tools like that actually can help quite a bit when it comes to structuring applications like this. All right, let's get into the actual UI though, because this is what the main reason we're here, and we want to actually see some user interface built into this. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to this info panel on the left-hand side of the screen, and we'll go and build that up. So let's go to the info panel. And typically your workflow for this, if you're using Kendo React, is first of all, you'll want to find the components that you're going to need to implement a given piece of functionality. So in this case, I've got my panel bar, which is going to be the sort of like accordion, expand, collapse sort of control. You'll need to import this or install this from npm. So I've already done this to save us a little bit of time, so we don't have to watch me npm install things here live. And then from there, basically you just use these as if they were any other React component. So I'm going to add in a little bit of code here that just gets some data from our backend. So the specifics here don't really matter. Basically, I'm just getting some data into this fund info. And then I'm going to use a panel bar. And the thing I like about the components is that they're pretty self-explanatory and usually pretty easy to read. So I'm going to have fund managers. If I could capitalize this. And I'm also going to have bar item title. See, I should have turned this one into a snippet as well. If you're curious how I did some of this, if just in case you need to do presentations or are looking to do this sort of thing as well, there is a thing built into Visual Studio Code for letting you do user snippets. And you can configure these things so you can type something like this and get it instantly into your code. And I like to do this for presentations so that you don't have to watch me meticulously type out every little thing. And I should have created one for this one to save us a little bit of time. And when I save this for this panel bar, you'll see that with just this little bit of code, I instantly have this start to a little panel bar. And what I like about the Kendo components, Kendo React components, is that they fit right in with React development. So these are native React components. So for example, I've got my fund info, And if I want to say, look at my managers, and this is actually, so I talked about the benefits of TypeScript. This is TypeScript helping me out here in my code, even in my JSX, to help me map this stuff out. So I have my managers and index, type this out. And what I will do is I'll start by just typing in, let's just go with an item for now. And this is the React or the Angular in me wanting to type in a, this is why you create snippets as well, so that you don't have to do parsing things live. So I have my managers, and I want this to be expanded as well. Oh, it doesn't like it. Object of keys, if you meant to register a collection, use an array instead. All right, we'll skip this bit. We'll skip this bit for now since I didn't create a snippet for it. And why don't we dive into the second part here. And for the details, let's do fund info. And again, this is TypeScript helping me out here. Fund info, oops. Dot quarters. So if we have quarters here, we'll try this map again, and we'll see if we are any more lucky this time. We need a parenthesis here, and we'll do this. And I think if we put in like some nonsense in here, we should get some details. Yeah, there we go. We get some details in. So I don't know what I typed wrong the first time, but we'll just go forth and pretend this is the right one. So we'll put in a quarter in an index. So we have some data in here. And actually in here, what I wanted to show is that you can actually nest these things. Oh, that's my manager one. So I can nest these things and actually provide some fun details here, and I can expand these things by default. And what I like about the Kendo React components is not only do they fit in to the React ecosystem, so they sort of logically fit back in, but their APIs are also fairly intuitive as well. And you can find a lot of these. So if you go to the Kendo React documentation, typically my workflow is I go out here and I search for a given component that I want to use. The search is quite good. So if I search for the panel bar component, I will find some demos. You're going to see a demo that looks pretty much exactly like what we're trying to build here today, and then I use them. This example, the panel bar, is probably not the single most compelling example of like the power of Kendo React, because panel bars are, you can find them everywhere. If you Google React panel bar or React accordion, you'll find a lot of different plugins that come along and do this sort of thing. The real power of Kendo React is having a consistent API and a consistent approach that you can use to build entire applications, really entire suites of applications or entire dashboards. So to do that, let's move on and actually build something that's a little bit more fun and complex and go over and work with some charts. So I'm going to head over to the allocation panel, which is going to be over here. We're going to build out a simple chart. So what I'm going to do is, again, bring in some data. So we're going to bring in some allocation data. And then down here, I'm going to actually start. So you'll see that, again, I brought in a component. So in this case, I'm going to use a Kendo React chart to actually display this data that I'm getting from my backend. And again, the API here is pretty elegant and easy to use. So I have a chart. The chart is going to have a title. And we'll call this asset allocation. And the other thing you need to provide is a chart series. And in this, you will have a chart series item. And you have to provide the type of chart you want. So we could do pi and then the data that you want to represent as well. It's data equals data. And we could see that just by saving that, once this refreshes, we should now see a really simple pie chart. So pretty simple to use. If you wanted to switch to donut charts, you could do this as well. I don't know, like maybe we have some people that know like graphic design or statistics that could tell me when you're supposed to use a pie chart versus a donut chart and whether any of that matters. But you'll see that with Kendo React, you get this sort of really logical set of building blocks. So for example, if I wanted to, let's see, throw some labels in here, and I have some content, and you'll see that it wants some content, and because I'm using TypeScript here, I get this really nice hover over functionality where it tells me the content of a label is optional, but it expects a function that returns a string. And it also tells me the fields that are available in the function argument are, and it lists a number of things here for me to use. So if I wanted to do, say, like render label, and I came up here and say, rendered label equals this, and I got some value, and then I returned, say this, and save it off. Then with that small change, oh, it wants me to give this a type. TypeScript is looking out for me, but I'm going to cheat it anyways. And I think the label goes, is it outside the series? Or actually, it might be, let me see if I got it right that time. I think it's in here, in the series items, that's going to let me show a label on this chart. Yeah, there we go. Although e.value, I might have gotten the value wrong. Return e.value, oh, e.value plus parentheses is what I wanted. So with this, I should have a label that shows. I could also do things like, we could kill the background and maybe make the color of here white as well. And the other thing I might want to do is give this thing a legend, which is going to be these labels that you see here, and move those to the bottom of the screen so they're out of the way of the pie chart. When we have that, we have a nice little pie chart that we can show. And again, if you go to the documentation, for example, on charts, you can get a sense of just the sort of breadth that is available as part of the Kendo React Charts package. So you have the things you'd expect, like bar charts, line charts, area charts, pie charts, as well as things that I swear you need like a degree in statistics to actually understand what they do. So like there's box plots, scatter charts. If you are building a dashboard for a financial institution and you have some weird data that you need to display, which you probably do, chances are we have a component in our charting library that will help you do that. All right, so I have another chart that I was going to show here, but I think I'm gonna move on just to try to keep us, save us a little bit of time. And I mentioned that the charts that we have are quite comprehensive because you might be thinking that this is all well and good. You can show that this is simple, but maybe you are dealing with a lot more data. The institution that you have is doing something a lot more complex than I have the ability to show in 45 minutes here live today. So I'll also point you at a second demo that we have, and I'll include, I have links to this in the slide deck so that you'll have access to them later. And this is a stock portfolio sample application that we offer with Kendo React that has a lot more thorough information than I have the chance to go into today, but is built using the exact same principles. So this is, again, a Kendo chart. This is, I believe, a candlestick chart, if I'm remembering correctly. This is using a tooltip on top of the chart. And you'll see Kendo React date pickers, for example, that you can use to configure the range shown on these charts, just showing that there's a lot of additional information and a lot of additional things that you can do. And I'll refer back to this one more time because I want to make sure we have time to also talk about the grid as well. All right, so let's do that. Let's get into the grid because I want to make sure I have a chance to show that as well. So I'm just going to close some things out. And then I'm just checking my notes. Let's go into the positions panel. So the real benefit of Kendo React is the fact that, we just added a chart, we have a panel bar, We're going to work with some other ones. I actually have a drawer in here, which is another Kendo React component that's hidden. And you can see just how well these components work together and how all of these are also available to solve any needs that you might have as you're building up your dashboards. So I'm going to go in here as a quick time check. We got time to implement this grid. And I'm going to, again, bring in some data. So the positions here don't matter. Because of TypeScript, I actually could go in and look at exactly what this position is. But for now, all I'm going to care about is I have some data and I want to actually show it in a table. So give the user the option to view some of these. And so what I'm going to do is I've got the grid in. And again, I've already installed this from NPM to save us a little bit of time. And what I'm going to do is kill this and paste in the starting point of the grid. So I'm saying, take that data that I get from my backend, and when I get it back, I'm going to take some of these and show them in a column. So I'm going to show the stock symbol, name, change percentage, volume, market cap, and whatnot. Now, a lot of people mentioned extensibility earlier as one of the key things that they're looking for in a UI library. And we saw some extensibility earlier in terms of like providing the label for these individual charts. I tried to show it on the details here before I screwed it up, but how you can easily extend using just familiar React syntax. So I've got one more example of that. And let's say for this grid, for example, I wanted to change how these change cells looked. So in most financial dashboards, if something is up, that means good, and you usually color that in green, and vice versa. If something is going down, you would usually color that in red. So Kendo React provides a handy little hook called, well, an attribute called cell, which essentially lets you control how each of these cells is actually rendered. So I'm going to do that. I will create a change cell. And again, I can hover over this, and because of Kendo React's TypeScript support and just TypeScript being pretty awesome in general, I get some help telling me that cell is actually going to want me to return a React function component, and it'll be rendered as a cell. And so what I can then do is come up in here and say const, we call this change cell, and this is a functional component, and it's going to take props, and those props are of types grid cell props. And you'll see if I just start by say, let's just return some nonsense just to see the pass-through that it works, that when I do that, I can take that cell and see now for those two cells that I specified that I'm using the change cell, I'm putting in some default values. But of course, that's not what we actually want to do. So I'm going to grab the value itself, and TypeScript is going to help me out here. I'm going to say props.field. And once I have the value, I can swap the value in here. And I can also say on the cell itself, so I want to give this thing a class name. And based off the value, so if I'm dealing with a value that's positive, that means something good happened. So I have a class name defined in my CSS of change up. And I've also got another one called change down. And they're simple rules that just make the values green and red. And what I like about this is just how powerful this is from an extensibility model. So first of all, this just feels like React code to me. I get a pretty easy extensibility hooks. I can do some pretty powerful things in terms of customizing my application in the hooks. And actually, this is the same sort of thing that's used actually on a bigger scale on our larger scale React apps in here. So for example, this cell here is using another Kendo React component. It's called a sparkline. I think it's called sparkline. There's so many chart names, I sometimes lose track of them. But this is another common thing you see in financial apps, just little charts embedded here and there. So in Kendo React, we have a component for helping you do that sort of thing. You see that in this example too, we're also swapping out the contents of the cells with a little custom animation as well. And those are going to be done using this exact same sort of approach. And really, this is the grid. The grid is our most popular component in Kendo React, partially because grids are so common. They're incredibly common as a way of displaying data. And also because our grid just does a whole lot. So I'll show the docs in a second, but like sometimes I feel like I can just sort of make up attributes for the grid and have them just work. So for example, if I wanted to give users the ability to just reorder cells, that's something I can do. I can give them the ability to resize cells as well. These are as easy to turn on as just enabling a simple attribute. And if we go and look at the docs, just to give you a little broader sense of this, I mean, you can get a sense just by looking at this. If you want to give your users the ability to sort large data sets, to filter them, to add paging, our more comprehensive sample app here too, if I head to this virtualized view, has an example of grouping. So if you have a large data set and you want users to be able to say, this is showing like shipping information. If I wanted to see things ordered by a specific customer, I can drag this up here and the grid will automatically group items from certain customers into a group here, while still allowing me to do things like expand collapse. I can filter, you can see the paging down here. I can export this content to Excel. So if I'm dealing with a financial data set and I need to have my users generate a spreadsheet from this, that's something that I can do as well. So overall, and actually the very last thing I will mention is that there is virtual scrolling built into the grid as well. So especially for those of you that are dealing with enormous data sets out there, I think this example has something like 50,000 rows in it. And you see that I'm easily able to scroll through this, and Kendo React handles the heavy lifting of virtualizing this and making sure it maintains performance. So hopefully you get a sense of just what is possible when using Kendo React to build these sorts of dashboards. You get a really consistent way of approaching your apps. All of your UI components look the same. There are 3 different themes that are built into Kendo React. This is the Bootstrap one, so I've got like Bootstrap-like colors throughout here. There's also a material design theme. There's also a default theme. There's a theme builder where you can tweak your apps to meet your needs. If like customizing UI components so that they match your existing designs is a concern, it's something that we can help you with as well. So hopefully between these things, you've gotten some tips and tricks that can help you build your apps. So just to sort of talk through some of the things that we talked about today in terms of best practices. So we talked about using semantic markup and minimizing your nesting. And then we looked at how to use grid layout as a potential way of solving that problem, or at least keeping your markup as slim as possible. And if you do prefer something like just class names for doing this, there's nothing wrong with that either. And that's another approach you might want to take. And we talked about establishing coding conventions, and we looked at how to use tools like ESLint to help us out with that. We talked about tools. Hopefully you saw why I really like TypeScript and why we really like TypeScript and Kendo React. It just makes it really easy to poke around your code. It catches all sorts of problems for you and helps you along the ways. And we also talked about minimizing your dependencies and why Kendo React can be a really awesome way of doing this, because it gives you a single UI library to standardize upon, really for all your needs for building these sorts of applications, really financial dashboards or otherwise. So I know we do have one final poll, and then I'm going to take a look at any questions that might have come in. And why don't we go ahead and throw this third poll up on the screen. So this question is, before signing this webinar, this one's pretty simple, have you heard of Kendo React? So this is a simple yes or no question. So if you could hop into the panel and do that, that would be great. All right, so currently we are at pretty much a dead 50-50. So make sure to jump in there and let us know what you think. So I will let that, we'll let that run for a minute. In the meanwhile, I'll mention if you have heard of us before, if you've used us before, thank you. Hello, thanks for coming back and checking us out today. For those of you that have not heard of Kendo React, for those of you that are answering no in the poll right now, you can head to kendoreact.com and click the Start Free Trial button. It'll basically start you can try everything Kendo React for free for 30 days. And you also get access to our support for 30 days as well to try out the tools and let us know what you think. All right, so the poll, it looks like about 60% yes, 40% no. So I think we can go ahead and, that one's been up for a minute, so I think we can wrap it up. Yeah, 61%. So awesome, a bunch of familiar faces and a bunch of new people as well. So for those of you that are new, thanks for checking us out. And I'm not seeing any additional questions flagged. So I think I'm going to start to wrap things up here. Thanks for you that joined us today. Again, you will be receiving an email with a link to the recording and all of the resources that we looked at today, including both the demo app that I built, the other Kendo React dashboard app that is out there. Another thing we'd like to know is whether you enjoyed this content. Did you find this interesting or useful? Or if you have any other ideas for other future content that you'd like to see through webinars like this or otherwise. So when you do get that email, just feel free to respond and let us know what you think. And if you have any questions, if you had any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask here today, feel free to reach out to us on Twitter as well with the handle Kendo React, or reach out to me. I'm TJ VanToll on Twitter. I'll be happy to help you out as well. So hopefully you found this interesting. Make sure to check out the resources and let us know what you think. And thanks.